This is scribble knitting, and it's a technique where you use two yarns that have a big difference between the weight and texture of each other, and you knit a few rows, however many you want, in one yarn, like this lightweight yarn that I have here. This is Crystal Palace Merino. And then you work a row or two in your contrasting yarn, and it makes a scribble in your knitting like this. This other yarn that I'm using is Malabrigo worsted. And I first read about this technique in the August 2012 issue of Knit and Style. On page 24 there is an article by Lorna Miser, and there's a pattern in there for a cowl, and she describes a couple of different ways that you can work this technique. And in my project, these are actually the yarns that I used. When I went to the yarn store to pick out my yarn, I had my Crystal Palace Merino, and the girls in the shop suggested that I use a ribbon yarn, but they did not have any, and I don't care for ribbon yarn anyway, so I just went ahead and got the Malabrigo worsted. There's not a huge difference like in texture, but I didn't want anything too crazy. I like how this turned out. I mean, there's obviously a difference, but it's nothing crazy or wild. So this is really easy. You want to work on double pointed needles or circular needles depending on how large your project is. And the reason you want to work on DPNs or circulars is because you're only working one row or maybe two in your contrasting yarn. So on some rows where you want to start knitting again with your first yarn, you're going to have to slide it back to the other end of the needle after you've knit in your contrasting row so that your working yarn is in the appropriate place for you to knit your next row. So I'm just going to show you how I did this for my project. So I have here, I'm ready to work a scribble row, which is my Malabrigo worsted. I'm just going to pick it up and knit my row. I'm going to wrap this yarn around my finger here to keep it out of my way a little bit.
We're popping up. We're popping up.
Alrighty. So now that I've knit my scribble row, normally when you're knitting, when you get to the end of your row, you turn your work so that your working yarn is ready for you to knit back. But I only want to do one row with this yarn, and then my next row I want to be in my first yarn here. So in order to work a row with this yarn, I need to slide this back to the other end of my needle. So that is why you need circulars or double pointed needles, so that you can slide your yarn back. I guess you could do it with straight needles. You would just be transferring them back, the stitches back onto your other needle. I think that would leave your tail of the yarn you want to use. Might be something to experiment with. Okay. Now, another thing with scribble knitting, since you're only going to be working a limited number of rows in your contrasting yarn, on the rows that you're not using it, you're going to need to carry it up along the side of your work. I don't know if you can see here how it's kind of locked in place along the edge here because I've been carrying it up as I work the rows with my Crystal Palace Merino yarn. you want to carry it up so that the next time you're ready to use it, you're not like pulling up from, say, down here. That would bunch up your fabric and you'd have this long loose loop. So by carrying it up along the side here, it'll hold it down. And how you do that, let me turn around here. So this is the yarn that I'm working with, my Crystal Palace Merino. And I'm just going to take my Malabrigo yarn here and place it over top of my Crystal Palace yarn. And then you can see that's wrapped around right there. So that's going to hold that in place along the side. So every time you start at the beginning of a row where your contrasting yarn is hanging around waiting for you to use it, you want to just put it over top of your working yarn so that it gets held in place on the side. See? Okay, and then you just continue knitting in that manner until your project is completed. I will put a link to Knit and Style on the blog, and you can get the link for the blog down below the video. You can purchase the magazine if you're interested in learning more. Let me just show you again how you would put the yarns so it carries up the side here. Okay, here is my working yarn. Just take the yarn that you're not using, put it over top of the working yarn. And knit. It's just getting wrapped up here. So that is scribble knitting.